everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Ernesto and the others who have organised this conference and who so generously have asked me to speak. Pierre Clastres notes in Chronicle of the Guayaki Indians that, quote, Indians are not information machines, and it would be a great mistake to think that they are always ready to answer questions. They answer if they want to, if they are in a good mood, if they have time, end quote. It would be nice to imagine that the pictograms at Cerro Azul in the Colombian state of Guaviare are not just too busy to talk, but angry at us as well. They do not volunteer much information about their meaning, and when they do answer our questions, we ask the wrong ones, and so the answers are always misleading. Like many bad listeners, it seems that we only hear what we want to hear, and so only understand what is irrelevant. Furthermore, we fail to hear the silence of the pictograms as anything but the melancholy tone of tragic absence. So what I want to try to do today is to think about how we might hear this silence in a positive way, according to its own agency and as an active force. In September last year, I travelled to the Serrania La Lindosa in Guaviare with a team of researchers from the National University in Bogotá. The trip was led by Professor Rosario Lopez and included a visit to the extraordinary rock painting site at Cerro Azul. I hope you can see a slide of this site. Cerro Azul is about 2 hours' drive from the city of San Jose in the Amazon. This visit will form the basis of the exhibition Trazas Oficios e Territorios, organised by Rosario, that is scheduled to open at the Museum of Modern Art in Bogotá on March the 7th of next year. I want to talk about these pictographs and the exhibition that they have inspired, and about the distance, the silence, and the break that connects these two events, the silence that science usually interprets as absence, but through art perhaps finds a voice in which to speak. One of the first facts we have to consider concerning the rock paintings at Cerro Azul is that these beautiful ancient signs are almost entirely opaque to us. Like so much of indigenous culture, both past and present, these signs cannot or will not be heard. The most obvious reason for this is that Western science and its institutions dominate the discourse around them, making it hard for indigenous to get their point of view across, should they want to. But in the case of the pictographs at Cerro Azul, it seems that indigenous people also don't know much about them. We visited the indigenous reservations of Panure and El Refugio near San Jose, which houses tribes from the Eastern Tucanoan linguistic family who moved to San Jose in the 70s and 80s from the Balpaz department a long way to the southeast. These are people displaced by violence. Rosario spent a lot of time talking with them about what they thought the nearby pictographs might mean. And while they were often happy to give suggestions, they also made it clear that the paintings at Cerro Azul were made by a different cultural group, one they knew nothing about. Or maybe they just didn't want to tell us. So what is known about these paintings? Recent archaeological digs at Cerro Azul have found evidence of human habitation from 12,000 years ago, and if the paintings are this old, it would make them some of the oldest human expressions found to date in the Amazon. Remains at the site indicate the processing of small animals, only small animals, which would suggest Cerro Azul was a ritual site rather than a place of residence. There are strong similarities between the paintings at Cerro Azul and those found 180 kilometers south in Chiribiquete National Park, and other sites even further away, suggesting they were painted by nomadic people who travelled widely and had contact or influence with other groups. These people are believed to have been part of the wider Karikona or Tucano cultures, which are both very similar. But the group responsible for Serra Azul no longer exists, and very little is known about them or the paintings that they have left us. The museum's response to this void of information has been to ignore or obscure it. The recent exhibition at the National Museum in Bogotá, El Jaguar y la Mariposa, Chiribiquete, Patrimonio Natural y Cultural a la Humanidad, included video documentation of 2 rock painting sites in the Chiribiquete National Park that have similar pictographs to those at Serra Azul. The video in the exhibition begins with a wide shot of the rock paintings, the camera then zooming into a single figure on the wall, which is highlighted and identified by a text, Ocelot facing forward. We might be surprised to find there is a forward to the pictographs, given they do not seem to face in any particular direction. But this is typical of the way their scientific processing by the museum projects information into them and then claims it as knowledge. Indeed, the video proceeds entirely in this manner, isolating figures and then identifying what they represent. This is a jaguar, this is a plant, this is a certain kind of fish, and so on. This information is not wrong in itself, because the people who produced these images had a sharp eye for empirical detail. But what is highly misleading is the suggestion that the pictographs are primarily representational. In fact, the video represents the meaning of the pictographs in the same way as it suggests the pictographs represent its objects, through a clear and distinct relationship between the signifier and its signified, providing an empirical self-evidence that assimilates the indigenous pictographs to the scientific objectivity of the museum or of the archaeologist. The information the pictographs give concerning local flora and fauna is, however, clearly incidental to their real cultural meaning. But because this meaning is not accessible to us, the museum simply ignores or talks over its invisibility in silence. For example, at the beginning of the exhibition video, we are told the site is called the, quote, abode of the gods in the local Carib language. But there is no more mention of gods in the video, nor do they appear in the identifications of the individual pictographs or in other museum material. The gods appear as invisible, but the museum has no way or desire to deal with this interesting disappearance. The museum's presentation of the Chiribiquete pictographs reflects the way archaeological research approaches them, both seeming relatively disinterested in the cultural meaning of the signs and focused instead on the representation of flora and fauna and what they tell us about the habitation and movement of the groups who made them. The typical analysis begins by dividing the rock wall into equal segments, establishing a typology of figures and then counting them. This then becomes the basis of the site's analysis and its comparison to other sites. The 2015 paper, A Record of Mammals in the Cave Paintings of Serra Azul, Guaviare, Colombia, tells us that on one of the walls, 38.7% of the figures represent deer, 14.7% represent bats, 3.2% represent foxes, and 2.1% show primates. On a second wall, 26.1% of the mammals are deer, 9.7% are tapirs, and 8.7% are rodents. The authors then note that, quote, Additionally, there are figures that do not correspond to the current fauna, end quote. There is no effort to account for the variations between the two walls, nor to classify or count the number of figures that do not correspond to known mammal types. No mention is made of the Tucano belief that animal spirits lived in such sites, sheltered by the master of game animals, a supernatural gamekeeper who discouraged hunters from approaching. There is also no interest in the areas of the walls that have been repeatedly overlaid with images to the point that no single image is now legible. These self-obscuring areas are very important, and we will come back to them. While it is true that the paper I quoted is interested in mammals rather than Tucanoan cosmology, the classificatory approach it employs is typical of research into pictographic rock paintings, as it is typical for their presentation within museums. What is most interesting escapes the net because it doesn't appear as information according to the criteria of scientific study. Another example, Philip Reris's study of rock art from the Middle Orinoco, groups motifs into a formal taxonomy that is not purely representational, but notes that 16.1% of the motifs couldn't be classified. It is perhaps surprising to learn that these aberrant signs are of no interest to this study, which was designed, quote, to show how stylistic similarity can support inferences about the degree of interconnectedness of pre-Columbian artistic traditions, end quote. It is as if what cannot be identified, classified, and counted cannot tell us anything, which is obviously a very narrow way of looking at things. In fact, this type of knowledge production seems part of the history of extractive industries that has accompanied and even defined colonial contact. We only take what we want without understanding what lies outside of this or its context. Against this approach, I would like to suggest that even if we cannot understand the precise meaning these pictographs had for Indigenous people, we can still listen to and feel their very beautiful silence when it is allowed to speak. By insisting on the representational nature of the pictographs, we not only ignore their cultural specificity, but also confine these images to the museum archive and to its scientific discourse. This turns them into dead objects without agency, objects whose meaning is determined by scientific dispositives and whose experience is dominated by affects of loss and guilt. Significantly, this is largely because the display of Indigenous objects in museums subtract perhaps the most important thing from them, which is their movement. Most Indigenous objects, and especially those that are used within the context of a ritual or performance, are not made to simply be looked at. In fact, their meaning was probably largely defined by their production. As Georges Bataille said of the paintings at Lascaux, quote, the actual doing embodied the entire intention, end quote. The museum, however, presents them in exactly the opposite way, entirely detached from the process of their making. Museological display of pictographic rock drawings, like those at Serra Azul, routinely removes the intellectual movement of their mnemonic function and the physical movement of accompanying ritual performances that probably involve dance and music. These performances are connected inasmuch as the pictograph's mnemonic function helped the performers and the audience understand the story that was being told and performed. As a result, their painting was specific to the ritual they were part of, and their meaning cannot be approached without exploring their wider ritual context. At Serra Azul, this is dramatically illustrated by the way the signs have been overlaid over the centuries to the point where they are illegible on the lower parts of the wall. This clearly indicates that the painting of the signs was more important than their later legibility, and that their function was immediate and part of what was happening around them, rather than being in any way aimed towards a future viewer. These signs were not made for us, and seem to confirm this in their gesture of self-erasure. This brings us to the question of how the pictographs at Cerro Azul can live on. How can they retain an agency under the ignorant and embalming gaze of science and the museum? How, in other words, do they survive the history of colonial extraction and their confinement by scientific knowledge? Edgar Garcia has recently written an interesting book about pictographs in Kipu whose meaning is not understood. Edgar Garcia has recently written an interesting book about pictographs that addresses this precise point. These unnatural signs, as he calls pictographs, hieroglyphs, and Kipu, whose meaning is not understood, requires a semiotics without semantics, or a very particular form of analepsis, where flashback imaginatively recreates the lost connection to the past. The key here, he argues, quote, is to focus on the semiotic and aesthetic forms of these signs and to observe how these forms have moved across languages and cultures to create contemporary experiences, insights, and relations, end quote. This, in a nutshell, is what Rosario Lopez is attempting to do in the exhibition Trazas, Oficios y Territorios, which confront these ancient images with work from the museum's collection and pieces by Rosario and other contemporary artists. These semiotic and aesthetic forms, as Garcia calls them, are on the one hand formal and artistic, and on the other affective, and these are the vectors along which an active absence, or what Garcia calls negativization, is able to touch and move us today. These are the vectors of a physiological aesthetics and an anthropological poetics, which I will try to develop today. The first thing we have to establish is that negativization is not a kind of carte blanche permitted by the tabula rasa of the indigenous object, as if it were a blank screen upon which to project our fantasies. Garcia formulates his and Rosario and my aims very precisely. Quote, to trace the life of signs beyond their archival entombment in ways that implicate contemporary making in the native worlds of the Americas, end quote. So to implicate the contemporary world in native worlds and not the other way round. One of Garcia's most effective examples is Kipu, the Andean art of knot writing. Garcia calls them negativized knots because their code has never been deciphered. But despite this, they have had a remarkable influence on contemporary poetry and art. Once more, this is not because they are suddenly liberated to become anything at all, but because artistic work on their meaning follows scientific findings, but then goes beyond its limits in a kind of imaginative research or creative memory. Additionally, the lack of information about them increases the intensity of their affective dimension, making artistic investigations of this dimension an effective research tool. As Garcia puts it, quote, while the meaning of these glyphs might be lost, their way of making meaning remains to give form to those illegibilities, end quote. Tracing these ways of making is what Garcia calls an anthropological poetics. We'll come back to this. The paleoanthropologist and early analyst of cave painting, André Leroy-Gorin, provides an alternative approach to deciphering the lost meaning of the pictographs. Prehistoric man, he argues, has a continuing unity with the environment, which is organized in an open series of contingent relationships rather than around a fixed point, which only emerges with sedentarization and the development of writing. The development of sedentary social groups, language, and technological development mediates humanity's relationship to the environment, and so Leroi-Gourhan argues, are not adequate for expressing the aesthetic. Leroi-Gourhan suggests that rock painting can teach us important lessons, in particular how, quote, human potentiality would be more fully realized if we achieved a balanced contact with the whole of reality, rather than our adoption of a regimented form of writing and the unrestrained development of technical utilitarianism it allowed, end quote. Pictographs express this balanced contact, Leroi-Gourhan argues, because they are the result of the direct perception of and reaction to visceral rhythms such as sleep, digestion, heartbeat, and so on, which underlie the prehistoric organization of space and time. While this element of what Leroi-Gourhan calls physiological aesthetics remains present in our own bodies, and our experience of the pictographs at Cerro Azul accesses the same level of physiological aesthetics used by prehistoric humanity. This basic aesthetic level also remains active, Leroi-Gourhan argues, in the modern lineage of abstract art. This is not, we should note, to claim any knowledge about indigenous culture, but rather to suggest that we might, through our experience of the pictographs at Cerro Azul, share some of their feelings. Art is a much more effective means for approaching these aesthetic rhythms because, Leroi-Gourhan continues, quote, at the summit of poetic art, we merely find ourselves at the head of a procession whose rearguard is still submerged in the hormonal darkness, end quote. As a result, he writes, quote, the purest art always plunges deepest. Only the uppermost tip emerges from the plinth of flesh and bone, without which it could not exist, end quote. So on this level of physiological aesthetics, there is a shared experience that connects us across cultures and across history. As we shall see, utilizing the transhistorical aesthetics of abstraction is one of the ways Rosario's exhibition tries to activate the pictographs, placing them in relation to various abstract paintings from the Museum of Modern Art's collection. Leroi-Gourhan also emphasizes, however, that pictographs, or mythograms as he calls them in this context, are directly connected to oral narratives and or ritual performance that accompanied or even structured their production. In this sense, we can speculate about the meaning of the images of Cerro Azul by referring to anthropological research into the meaning of their symbols. Gerardo Reichel-Dolmatov, for example, has written about how the hallucinogenic plant Banisteriopsis, more commonly known in the West by its Peruvian name of ayahuasca, is used in shamanic practice and influences the applied art of the Tucano peoples. Abstract and figurative symbols found at Cerro Azul, including grid patterns, zigzags, and undulating lines, concentric circles and chains of dots, along with figurative elements such as plants, animals, humans, and unknown creatures, are all attributable to the psychotropic effects of ayahuasca. Reichel-Dolmatov identifies 20 common motifs in ayahuasca-induced visions, many of which can be found at Cerro Azul, and claims that 15 of these motifs are also neurophysiological phosphemes that are common to all people. The Tucano people interpret these symbols in various ways, some referring to the incest taboo and the laws of exogamy. While Reichel-Dolmatov admits these interpretations are culturally based, He also claims, quote, there exists an element of rhythm, of pulsation in the imagery of banisteriopsis, intoxication, that seems more likely to be organically based than determined only by a visual and culturally moulded memory, end quote. In this respect, Reichel Domatov's work clearly follows Leroy Goran's exploration of a physiological aesthetics. Another approach to the question of how the pictographs at Cerro Azul could affect us can be found in the work of the anthropologist Eduardo Vivaras de Castro. De Castro has recently claimed that, quote, anthropology is ready to fully assume its new mission of being the theory/practice of the permanent decolonization of thought, end quote. De Castro makes this perhaps surprising claim because, he says, the indigenous cultures that are the objects of anthropological study, in fact, quote, co-produce the theories of society and culture that it formulates, end quote. Anthropological theory, De Castro writes, is a version of an indigenous practice of knowledge. The foundation of this indigenous anthropology, reverse anthropology, or counter-anthropology, as De Castro variously calls it, are interspecific perspectivism, ontological multinaturalism, and cannibal alterity. The first involves a crucial reversal. I'm talking now about interspecific perspectivism. Europeans differentiate cultures on the basis of a shared material ground, nature, while Amazonian Indians differentiate species based on a shared socio-spiritual ground, which is myth. This means that while Europeans accepted the Indians shared a common human body, they doubted that they had souls. While Indians assumed the Europeans shared the same soul, but were not convinced that they had the same body. From an indigenous Amazonian point of view, De Castro claims, souls inhabit the world in embodied form, which takes shape around them according to their perspective. This is the reverse anthropology of the Indians, and what is, for them, culture is universal and nature is particular. What is objective is the subjective, and what is transcendent is immanent. As a result, De Castro writes, quote, if Western relativism has multiculturalism as its public politics, Amerindian schematic perspectivism has multinaturalism as its cosmic politics, end quote. Each mythic entity is a pure virtuality, not actually determined, and a turbulent mythic flux rumbles beneath the surface distinctions separating types and species. In perspectivism, every kind of being appears to others as it appears to itself, as human, even if it acts by manifesting its distinctly animal, plant, or spirit nature. The human is predator, the animal is prey, and each entity therefore appears according to the specific ratio of this intensive difference. If anthropology traditionally assumes a cultural relativism or a multiculturalism resting on a universal nature, Amazonian Indians propose the inverse, that the cosmological subject is human and has agency depending on their point of view, constituting a multinaturalism. What is most significant for us about this switch to perspectivism is that through it, the classified becomes the classifier, and it is no longer a question of ordering the species of nature, as we saw the video in the National Museum doing, but of understanding how individuals differentiate themselves. In this, De Castro claims, indigenous thought and anthropology are engaged in the same thing. Quote, it is a matter of actualizing the innumerable becomings other that exist as virtualities of our own thinking. To think an outside in order to run against the grain of thought of the outside by starting from the other end, Every experience of another thinking is an experience of our own. This is not a mapping of the other in our own terms, but rather the creation of series of disjunctive syntheses composing a continuous flux of discontinuities. In this sense, knowledge is not a representation of the unknown, but a way of interacting with it. In this, it is divergence that is creative and that embodies the ontology of life. As De Castro puts it, quote, "Good translation succeeds at allowing foreign concepts to deform and subvert the conceptual apparatus of the translator, such that the intentio of the original language can be expressed through and thus transform that of the destination." End quote. This is precisely the function of cannibalism, the semio-physical prehension of the perspective of the enemy through eating them. Anthropophagy as anthropology is the way De Castro puts it. This economy of predatory alterity is the basic metabolism of Amazonian society, and the interiority of the social body constituted and maintained through the capture of symbolic resources from outside. In this sense, indigenous culture has no essence, because its interior self is only constituted on the outside. Its immanence coincides with its transcendence, is how De Castro puts it, in a formulation that once again seems promising for our relationship to the pictographs of Serra Azul. Can we, in other words, become the inhuman prey of an ancient indigenous culture, and so provide an external perspective and semio-physical sustenance on which they might feed? In answering this question, let us go back to the obscure gesture that created the solid red ochre walls at Serra Azul, which seems to hide the pictographs in the very act of painting them, and so prefigures the creator's disappearance. How can this negativization of the pictographs have agency today? How can they speak to us? And how can we open our ears? Trazas, Oficios et Territorios is a complex and very beautiful response to precisely these questions. I can't deal with all of the aspects of the exhibition because, as I write, not all of its parts have been finalized. But I will focus on some specific aspects that directly relate to what I have tried to briefly outline here. First, it is important to point out that the exhibition contains works by Indigenous artists who have been invited to respond to photographs from the Museum of Modern Art's collection by Louis Brito of dolls made by Armando Reveron. This invitation not only tries to reverse the usual direction of influence, in which the indigenous only ever appears as the object of the Western artist's interest, but it also uses disjunctive synthesis to extend and grow the exhibition, exploring the gaps and absences of its own structure as a creative and productive force. Brito's photographs provoke questions about the nature of humanity, and it would be nice to imagine that the indigenous response answers some of the questions we have seen raised by De Castro. But I haven't seen this work, it's still in the process of being made, so I won't say any more about it. Another way Rosario addresses the colonial history always already built into the architecture of the museum and its mechanisms of display and examination is by placing photographs of Serra Azul on the walls of the museum and the other works on tables or on the floor. This direct contrast of vertical and horizontal planes gives priority and dominance to the indigenous images, drawing attention to the history of colonial subordination and exploitation, and attempting its symbolic reversal. It is also a way of drawing attention to the pictograph's agency, at least in the context of the exhibition, the way they continue to express themselves in our feelings or imaginings, and are active and assertive rather than just sad signs of loss. This is a way of refusing the museum's function as a mortuary, where it lays out bodies for autopsy and extracts scientific information from corpses. Instead, Rosario is inviting us to experience them, to imagine them, and to offer our exteriority to them as a perspective through which they might live. This reversal frames another important part of Trazas, Oficios et Territorios, which is the confrontation of the pictographs with modern abstract works by artists such as Eduardo Ramirez Villamizar from the museum's collection. This focus on form accesses the history of indigenous influence on Latin American modernist art, stretching from the Mexican muralists to neo-concretismo's interest in a modern primitivism based on the vital structures of ritual and gesture. Perhaps the most important figure in this tradition is the Uruguayan artist Joaquin Torres Garcia, who believed that Latin American indigenous symbols expressed a universal abstract language that was also the basis for modernist abstraction. For him, this was a way in which Latin American artists could engage their own culture through modernist art. Although interesting in this context, Torres Garcia thought the geometrical patterns and forms found in pre-Columbian pictograms and modernist abstraction translated pure laws of thought, which constituted, he thought, the primitive ground. While Torres Garcia's Neoplatonist conception of abstraction is quite foreign to the materialism of Trazas, Oficios et Territorios, other figures in the history of Latin American abstraction, such as Lygia Clark and Elio Oiticica, explored indigenous cultures' aesthetic relations with the world and were especially interested in the way they integrate the individual into collective experience. Similarly, the direct comparison of indigenous and modernist abstraction in Trazas, Oficios et Territorios proposes a resonance between indigenous and modern expressions that is based upon a physiological aesthetics integral to all forms of life, a vital structure, perhaps, that allows us to experience the pictographs in a way similar to that of indigenous people. For Clark and Oiticica, as for Léry-Goron, the experience evokes an other ontology, a spatio-temporal openness more attuned to our environment and perhaps more useful than the certainties and speculations of scientific knowledge. The next object from the exhibition I want to look at is a work by Rosario Lopez, where she has embroidered abstract shapes taken from the walls of Cerro Azul onto a tablecloth that had been embroidered by a woman and her family in the early part of the 20th century. What is interesting about this beautiful object, I think, is that it does not seek to homogenize the different cultural forms through comparison, but rather show how the indigenous motifs retain their otherness even while being translated into colonial materials. The regularity of Western decoration is disrupted by the red forms appearing in its midst, but their shared material and technique also integrate the new shapes into the object. This disjunctive synthesis seems to embody the ambiguous borderline between cultural amnesia and an anthropological poetics seeking to revitalize the forgotten, and so embodies the pitfalls and promise of a decolonized artistic practice. In this sense, then, the tablecloth must be seen as a corrective to the exhibition's comparison of indigenous symbols and modernist abstraction, because while that explores our shared physiological aesthetics, the tablecloth reasserts the disjunction between now and then, them and us, and in sharing its surface, seeks to turn this distance productive. What immediately strikes us is the way the tablecloth's original decoration is unified and structured across its surface, upon which the indigenous symbols appear as scuttling disruptions. The pictographs have a subversive movement, while the floral decorations are flat, fixed, monumental, placid. This is not to speculate on the meaning of the pictographs or to judge the decorative aspects of the tablecloth. Rather, the work proposes a relationship between dissimilar energies and invites us to experience it. Unlike the modernist works, the tablecloth does not propose an aesthetic or ideal continuity between indigenous and colonial symbols, but rather seeks to utilize their difference within a shared space of social ritual. In this way, the tablecloth offers us a scalable methodology of disjunctive syntheses, one that gives the pictographs of Cerro Azul agency across all the various experiments composing trazas oficios et territorios. Finally, however, and as a last corrective, I would like to briefly discuss a series of ceramic sculptures Rosario made for the exhibition by producing a latex mould from rocks taken from Cerro Azul, and in some cases combining them with woven objects purchased from the Tucano communities we visited in San Jose. These forms are literally made by taking away the rock of Cerro Azul and replacing it with contemporary material. They are, we might say, the most dialectical version of the method of disjunctive synthesis, because they are both the most objective representations of Cerro Azul, while also being the most emphatic incorporations of Cerro Azul's absence. One of the rocks is even open to reveal its genetic whole. It is as if they are a warning, taking us back to the museum's fascination with representing the pictographs from Chiribiquete as representations. Such literalism can only capture a void. In this sense, the rock's seamless synthesis of the site and non-site of Cerro Azul is also the clearest statement of the site's negation. The rocks offer agency to the site within the museum by actualizing its absence. When Rosario combines some of these rocks with woven materials she bought from the Tucano, it is as if she is composing an uncomfortable warning that our desire to activate the ancient indigenous pictographs at Cerro Azul can as easily vaporize as vitalize indigenous content in contemporary art. Our last image is therefore an elegant sculpture Rosario made by placing a rock within the mouth of an indigenous fishing implement, which both saturates us with multiple sensations and associations, while simultaneously giving a strange and uncomfortable sensation of blockage. These perhaps are the poles of our possible engagements with the pictographs of Cerro Azul. Thank you.
Many thanks. Fantastic talk. As I said at the beginning, we were waiting for questions. No questions arrived so far, and I think they won't. So I will just pose a question, which is more a commentary or a question, so you can elaborate more your arguments. Estaba diciendo Stephen que no llegaron preguntas, entonces yo le voy a hacer una para empezar a ver, para motivar si los demás participantes quieren preguntarle algo, que es tanto pregunta como comentario y que es más algo que le permitirá elaborar algunos de los argumentos. A mí me parece que la charla es un alegato en buena medida y sobre todo la primera parte contra el conocimiento moderno, cómo proyecta sus supuestos sobre algo que no conoce, reduciendo eso que no conoce a sus propios términos, pero negándose a entenderlo en sus propios términos, no los términos modernos, sino los términos de aquello que no conoce. Es decir, reduciéndolos y no traduciéndolos. La pregunta que querría yo hacerle a Stephen es ¿cómo puede ser el arte una traducción, no una reducción de conocimientos no tan modernos? Yours is an argument against modern knowledge, I gather, how it projects its assumptions on something it does not know, reducing it to its terms, but refusing to understand it on its own terms. the terms of that what knowledge doesn't know. That is not translating those terms, but reducing it to the modern terms. My question to you then is, how can art, you've talked about this, it's just a question that will give you the opportunity to elaborate more on your arguments. How can art avoid reducing other knowledges to the canon of modernity?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for your question, Christopher. It's a great question. I mean, I think I'm much more interested in thinking about how art can help us experience these mysterious pictograms at Cerro Azul than I am in launching some kind of attack against science or against modern knowledge. Perhaps the first one involves a little bit of the second one, but what my focus really is to try and find a way that these seemingly obscure objects, images, can still have an agency and activity today. Do you want to translate this as we go? Or?
Yeah. Just go ahead and I'll just make a short summary at the end.
Sure, okay. So I guess this is the idea of the paper, that I'm just simply suggesting two possible directions in which we could utilize some of the things that art offers us as a way of approaching these very mysterious images. And for me, in my work, I mean, I work a lot about art, I work a lot about contemporary art, and I'm engaged also a lot in debates about what constitutes art, so aesthetics from a philosophical point of view. And for me, the most important thing, my background is Deleuze, Lyotard, thinkers like this, the most important element of art is aesthetics. So it's a sensation. And of course, Leroi-Gourhan is such an interesting figure because he was very influential for this generation of French philosophers. And one of the things that I think they pick up on is this idea of what he calls physiological aesthetics. So a kind of understanding of aesthetic sensation that is both trans-historical and trans-cultural. And I think this is a kind of an idea that Leroi-Gourhan introduces as a way of trying to understand images that come to us from a time that is so remote from us that really they carry almost none of their own context with them. And this is effectively what the images from Cerro Azul are. So this kind of idea of a kind of an aesthetic, a kind of sensorium that we can use to approach the images, which is not to understand the images, but which is try to experience something that those who made them experienced. I think this is one direction. And, you know, I tried to show various people who have made efforts in this way. Of course, there are problems with this direction as well, because, you know, trans-historical ideas, trans-cultural ideas, these are also things that need to be handled very carefully. And then the second way is this poetic anthropology, anthropological poetics, which is more about a way of kind of taking this absence and making it active, like giving it agency, like how it's possible that something which is basically evades any kind of scientific investigation, that basically is not available to knowledge, how can this, instead of just being seen as a sign of something that we've lost, or they do this thing where they try and show the way that it's similar to what we do or know ourselves. Instead of doing this, to try and approach this absence or this kind of lack of understanding or knowledge that we have, like even from the point of view of its possibility, how this can be actually something that can speak, not just for us or to us, but through us.
Bueno, hay dos caminos. Realmente lo que está diciendo Stephen es, como lo decía yo antes de la pregunta, es elaborando más lo que ya dijo en la ponencia. Y los dos caminos que presenta son lo que Leroy llamaba la estética fisiológica, que apela a un sustrato común que nos permite relacionarnos con cosas que son verdaderamente otras, o que por lo menos son extrañas para nuestra vida cultural cotidiana. Y lo otro es la antropología poética, que no busca tanto entender algo que no comprendemos, sino tratar de relacionarse a través de la experiencia con eso que no conocemos. No es el entendimiento en el sentido moderno, que es un entendimiento reductor, porque reduce aquello que no conocemos a lo que conocemos, sin tratar de entender eso que no conocemos en sus propios términos. Y la antropología poética, que forma parte de algo que se ha llamado desde hace unos cuantos años, no solo en antropología, sino también en otras indisciplinas, el giro ontológico, lo que está tratando es de romper con esas dicotomías modernas, ese binarismo moderno que marca, uno de cuyos términos marca al otro, y más bien tratar de relacionarse con eso en su lugar, con ese mundo distinto en su lugar, ese conocimiento no tan moderno entonces, y voy a usar una expresión de Eduardo Viveiro de Castro que Stephen mencionó en su charla. Viveiros habla de que para los modernos la forma de lo otro es la cosa, porque el conocimiento moderno cosifica, objetiva. Ese es el papel, entre otras cosas, de los museos. Mientras que en los conocimientos no tan modernos, la forma del otro es la persona. Y entonces allí quiero darle nos están llegando preguntas. Bueno, yo iba a seguir conversando con Stephen, pero más bien me callo porque están llegando preguntas, veo aquí en el chat. A ver, dice David, nos llegan otras preguntas, se los voy a compartir por aquí. Aquí hay una pregunta. ¿Cree usted que estos pictogramas pueden ser considerados arte? Que la intención más que comunicativa sea expresiva. There's a question for you, Stephen. Do you believe that these pictograms can be considered art? That the intention was more communicative than expressive?
I mean, I think they can be considered art if you want to consider them art, but I don't think that considering them art is necessarily the most interesting way of thinking about them. I mean, art is a super Western conception, and the whole story about anthropology's dealing with art, quote unquote art, from indigenous peoples is a long and complicated story, and it's not always so easy to bring this category across, I think, and apply it to indigenous cultural expression. So, I don't personally, I don't really think it's that interesting to think about whether it's art or not art. I don't think that's really what I'm kind of trying to do. Whether it's art or not doesn't really make any difference to what I'm trying to explore, which is what the kind of affirmative and productive powers of these pictograms could be today. And that to me is much more interesting. Now, whether that makes them art or not art, I'm not even sure if that has anything to do with what they were originally meant to be. I think that's got much more to do with what kind of material we give to support them today. And so if we want to make art with them, then I think we can. And obviously that's what Rosario has already been involved with, and many other artists as well. And they make art with it. But whether the pictograms at Cerro Azul are art or not, I'm not sure if that's really that interesting a question.
Bueno, la verdad es que la pregunta no le interesa mucho, en el sentido de que no le interesa preguntarse si los pictogramas de Cerro Azul son arte o no. Esa es algo que no está en el horizonte de su indagación y de su investigación, porque en realidad el concepto arte, llamar a las pictogramas de Cerro Azul arte es reducirlas a lo moderno. Esa ese conocimiento que ha hecho la estructura binaria entre arte y artesanía. Lo moderno es artístico y lo de los primitivos, es decir, los no modernos, es artesanal. Además, porque reducirlos a arte sería desplazar el interés de donde no está, el interés que realmente lo mueve, y desde luego a Rosario y la exposición que está organizando para el Mambo, es el poder expresivo y comunicativo de las pictografías, no si es arte o no es arte. One more. Podríamos considerar que, diablos, ahora hay más. Aquí hay una. Well, it's in English already. How are North American countries organized in ethno-educational processes? ¿Cómo están los países norteamericanos organizados en procesos etnoeducativos?
Unfortunately, I don't really think I'm qualified to answer that question, or maybe I could put it more simply. I don't know the answer to that question because, you know, I'm an independent researcher, so I'm not directly involved in university institutions, and ethno-education is not my area. So thank you for the question, but I'm terribly sorry. I can't really say much about it.
No problem. No, él no está involucrado con ese tema, así que no la puede responder. Podríamos considerar los pictogramas de Cerro Azul o Chiribiquete actuales, y en qué consiste su actualidad. Well, the question asks about the actuality of the contemporaneity of Cerro Azul o Chiribiquete, porque actuality es otra cosa en inglés. How contemporary they are, and if that, in what lies its contemporaneity?
I mean, I think it's always difficult to talk in a general sense about this, because in Cerro Azul, for example, the earliest pictograms they assume are from around 12,000 years ago. But the site was used, you know, off and on. They think right up to to colonial times. So there was a very vast stretch of time over which the site was painted, and so any given pictogram that you look at, it could be from any time during that period, although if you remember the photographs, the images that are further up are perhaps more recent than the ones that are accumulated below. And I think, you know, I don't have such specific information about Chiribiquete, but I think it's similar. It's a similar time span that the images have been accumulated over. So, you know, I think stylistically they're close. And so I think that it's generally understood that there is at least strong cultural interaction between the people who produce the paintings, if not actually the same people involved in nomadic culture producing them.
Well,
or some
either I translated wrongly, or the question was phrased in a way that was not understood. I'll just phrase it differently as I understand it. What the person is asking is whether the pictograms are contemporaneous, or how can we consider them contemporaneous? How can they speak to us now?
Sorry, I thought you meant whether they were from the same time.
No, I just possibly was my.
Okay, how can they speak? Well, I mean, this is the thing that's very interesting, because obviously they can speak in all sorts of different ways, and it's a kind of ventriloquism, and different kinds of ventriloquism that, you know, make them say different things. And so the museum in Bogota, in the recent exhibition that focused on the paintings of Chiribiquete, was interested in them almost entirely as representational images that showed real animals and real plants, and were interested in them as representations. Now, for them, that was contemporary, because they are interested in seeing how fauna and flora have remained the same, have changed, etc., etc. There are various kind of scientific findings that can be drawn from that. But I think there are other ways of approaching them which are less to do with what information the images have and more to do with what kind of a relationship to the world they might be able to communicate to us. And I think that's more what I'm interested in exploring.
Claro, uno puede ver la contemporaneidad de las pictografías desde dos puntos de vista. Uno, que es el científico, al cual se refirió Stephen largamente en la primera parte de la charla, que es qué clase de conocimiento hay allí, y reducirlo a términos de conocimiento, qué clase de plantas, qué clase de animales, tantos porcentajes de esto, tanto porcentaje del otro. Él realmente no está interesado en esa perspectiva de lo contemporáneo de los pictogramas. Más bien está interesado en el tipo de relaciones con el mundo que ellas están revelando. Y allí sí, entonces, que creo que es, por lo que entiendo por la exposición de Rosario, no se ha hecho y solamente podemos ver fragmentos en la charla de Stephen, que es lo que Rosario también está interesada, es decir, qué tipo de mundos y qué tipo de relaciones nos permiten esos pictogramas. No solamente ver, sino entrar en ellas, porque el conocimiento, si nosotros reducimos el conocimiento a algo exterior con lo que no nos relacionamos, pues y hacer de aquello con lo que conocemos algo activo también. De nuevo, para usarlo de Viveiros, la forma del otro no es entonces la cosa, sino la persona. ¿Tenemos tiempo para otra pregunta, David? No. Bueno, there's no more time for questions. Stephen, many thanks. It's been extremely, many thanks. Muchas gracias a todos.